Let's talk about one core stratagem in Warhammer 40k that I think more people should probably be using. Perhaps not the most immediately obvious to new players, but a sleeper hit that can bring some of the biggest swings in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I wanted to do a focused deep dive on one stratagem, one that I've had some fun with in recent games of 40k, and I feel like one that's underutilised by newer players compared with more experienced ones. The stratagem that I'm talking about is Rapid Ingress, one of Games Workshop's slightly newer innovations for 10th edition 40k. I feel like it probably shouldn't be underestimated as one of the single ways of causing the most carnage in the enemy army and getting yourself a massive swing of extra damage output out of a single command point. Though I feel like it's maybe a stratagem that's often used by people who are more commonly going to things like tournaments as opposed to players in more casual play. Perhaps just because the way it could be used could vary from game to game and is maybe a little bit dependent on things like terrain positioning and knowing the enemy army kind of well. It's definitely not the hardest thing to get good mileage out of though, so I thought in this one we'd talk through the stratagem and the primary way that it gets you good advantages, and just talk through a few real examples of how it could apply in game. Starting with the basics, Rapid Ingress is used at the end of the enemy movement phase, so you're basically seeing exactly where they've moved all of their troops and you basically have perfect information for their positioning, barring anything like charges happening later in their turn. If you've got units that can turn up from reserve, from things like Deep Strike or Strategic Reserve, then it means that you can then immediately bring one of those units onto the board. Typically by those reserve rules, it's usually going to be dropping greater than 9 inches away from enemy foes, and gets to set up on the board before the opponent does the rest of their turn. Typically, you wouldn't be able to do it on turn 1 due to most units not being able to set up from reserve then anyway. Obviously, after you bring a unit down, your opponent gets to shoot and charge with the rest of their army, dealing a lot of damage. So obviously what you don't want to do is just put it somewhere where the opponent can deal some good damage to it, and pay 1 command point for the privilege of your opponent getting to destroy one of your valuable reserve units a bit early. The primary way that Rapid Ingress has so much power is setting up a charge that the opponent really can't do a whole load about. As mentioned, it might depend a little bit on terrain or the amount of big heavy guns in the enemy's line of sight, but I feel like in at least the majority of Warhammer 40k games, you're at least going to get the opportunity to use Rapid Ingress in a pretty powerful way of one sort or another. Just because typical terrain levels tend to be at least reasonably high in Warhammer 40k, or at least if you're playing with a recommended amount from Games Workshop, and most armies are going to struggle to keep literally all of their most important units screened, unless they have a really excessive amount of chaff infantry. The general idea to get the core value out of it would be to have one of your units drop down, ideally land somewhere that's safe from enemy shooting and charging, so out of line of sight, and not within reliable charge threat range of any of their heavy melee troops. Because you've chosen somewhere that's just completely out of line of sight of units that you care about damaging them, then they're going to be completely safe, and when it gets back to your turn again, you're then free to move them up, and then get a very short charge off on one of the enemy units, rather than just gambling to get a 9-inch charge from reserve. Even if you have to set up something like 12 or 13 inches away, it means that after a movement you're probably going to be getting a charge far closer than 9 inches, really tipping the balance as to whether it's likely to come off, and particularly if you can spare a further command reroll. The reason that it's so powerful in Warhammer 40k is that melee damage, and to an extent close range shooting as well, tends to be far more efficient per point of unit compared with if you have long range firepower. It kind of makes sense for most units. Most things with long ranges are usually going to be able to inflict their damage pretty reliably from a very safe distance from the enemy army, so it makes sense that the units that have had to go through the gauntlet of getting into melee and all the barriers to that are going to do more damage when they get there, just to make the game fair. Rapid Ingress either on strategic reserves or deep strikers is just a way of shortcutting this. In the right circumstances, it means that you basically get to put down a melee unit, have it be pretty much safe from the enemy army's shooting, and then make a near enough guaranteed charge into reserve, unless you get spectacularly unlucky. In 40k, the difference between getting the first strike on the enemy or them getting to hit your melee unit first, either with a charge or with shooting, is really quite a big thing, so it is quite a big advantage compared with units starting on the board. It can also be really quite helpful for objectives as well. They could be another valuable target alongside whatever unit you're trying to get the jump on. Units coming out of reserve and then shooting the enemy probably aren't going to be able to land within range of objective markers, as the enemies are likely to already be there. Rapid Ingress is a way that you can pretty reliably get the unit down, destroy the enemy unit, and then actually finish up on the objective, which hopefully should be helpful enough for victory points. Just for a few examples from my own games of 10th edition, I thought I'd just run through a few ways in which Rapid Ingress has helped me in a couple of matchups. Obviously, this isn't anything particularly high minded strategy, but just maybe a couple of good things that demonstrate how it can do work. With a few games that have had it with Imperial Knights, I've often found that just putting one Armoured Warglaive in strategic reserve can be a good way to mess with the enemy. It's not really quite big enough a threat to warrant trying to screen literally everything and everywhere. Could mess with the opponent's positioning quite a lot if it made them do that, but then on the other hand it's both fairly tough, fairly fast and fairly dangerous, kind of pretty ideal as a distraction card effects from days long ago. In a couple of games that I've had with it, in one game I was playing against Necrons, and there were a few choices of where to put it, though I chose to deploy it on a flank where there was another Armored Warglaive facing down a big unit of Necron Immortals. One of them wouldn't have been enough to wipe the unit, would probably just have bounced and then they would have used reanimation protocols to heal up to full strength again, and they'll still be in control of the objective. But by adding a second one to the mix and having them both be able to essentially just move, shoot, and then go on to charge the unit, that was just enough to just tip the balance and wipe the squad out completely, not giving them any chance to stand back up again. Obviously a bit of a case of two units clubbing together to bully one other one, but quite a nice way to get the second armature also to be able to do full movement shooting and damage dealing, as it's set up somewhere that was just a little bit too far out of range of the other Necron anti-tank units that were broadly on the other side of the board. After that, those two armatures would be probably taking a bit of return fire, but would then be fine to move on and try and take the fight to the rest of the enemy. Another game I had chance to set one up somewhat within range of Adeptus Custodius Sisters of Silence that were holding down their backfield, and the way that the terrain worked out meant that the Caladius grav tanks that were the main anti-tank weren't able to see them, even if a few Guardian Spears and things could. It meant that the Armature Warglaive was a problem that just couldn't really be dealt with, and then the next turn the Armature could go in and make a very reliable short charge and wipe out the Sisters of Silence on the enemy's home field objective, meaning that now there was an Armature in the ruin that they were previously holding it with, and giving the opposing player a rather annoying decision as to whether or not they would send back a big unit to wipe out the Armature and take their home objective back, or push on and continue the main fight with the other knights. It was particularly handy to be able to wipe out a cheap unit, but also be able to take an objective and give the opponent tough decisions. Then finally, in a third game when I was playing as Space Marines, I had the chance to bring down a Terminator unit to be able to be around about 10 or 11 inches away from an enemy Chaos Forge Fiend, something that could have absolutely made mincemeat of them if it could have shot them directly, but by putting them out in a pleasing line formation it meant that all of them were just about out of line of sight, and the other units that could see them were only going to do chip damage at best. Then the next turn they were able to stride up, gun down some cultists with their storm bolters, and then make a charge on the Forge Fiend, which while it didn't do an amazing amount of damage as I rolled a little bit low, had a very good chance of one-shotting the thing, particularly with some firepower that was chipped in by other units. It did mean that the Forge Fiend then had to choose between either falling back and wasting all its firepower, or remaining in combat and basically being power-fisted to death though. It got one more round of shooting in before it died in the enemy turn, and then the Terminators were free to consolidate back onto the objective that the cultists had. I'm not saying that any of these are particularly clever tactical moves or anything like that, but I feel like all three of them kind of demonstrates just how big a swing it can be when you bring in a unit to be able to charge the enemy in a position that they can't really do all that much about. It potentially can make a fairly tame unit get the jump on an enemy unit that might have been a lot more threat to them, and do so kind of reliably rather than praying for a 9-inch deep strike charge. I'd say getting close range things to do their damage better is perhaps the main reason for Rapid Ingress. Seems quite nice for a fair few units, perhaps things like Death Guard, Death Shroud Terminators, or Tau Commander Farsight getting his close range damage boost off before maybe even charging. But you perhaps could have different more niche applications as well, say just jumping onto objectives earlier if there was one completely unclaimed for some reason. Provided your unit could set up safe, then you could guarantee that you're going to get points at the start of your next command phase. You might have other potential reasons, like flyers trying to do bombing runs, not that that's enormously efficient, or perhaps have tricks with units that can set up in different ways, like just outside of 3 inches of the enemies. Units like Inceptors might be able to do some pretty powerful shenanigans, though they are an expensive unit, potentially even stealing an objective right from under the enemy's nose if they had something with like 1 or 2 objective control on, and they weren't going to be able to wipe out any Inceptors in return. I'm definitely not trying to say that Rapid Ingress is just an auto win option or anything. It definitely does have downsides, and I feel like you need to use it right. I feel like it's definitely possible that you might fall foul of an enemy movement shenanigan or something like that, and manage to get your unit killed in the enemy turn, and it turn into a complete disaster. Just in general though, I've certainly seen a few people just using it to turn up with a unit on the enemy turn, only to have that unit just immediately gunned down by some scary enemy threat that could see them. Pretty much the worst of all possibilities there, as you both burnt a command point and the unit, and they never even had the option to make a charge or try and shoot. If that was going to be the case, you're probably going to be best off just bringing them in reserves normally. Definitely look for opportunities where you could use it to get an auto charge on something important, but getting an automatic charge on something unimportant, or just getting a unit killed earlier is definitely just going to be a complete waste of time. Otherwise, I feel like there's definitely a few other downsides to using Rapid Ingress. It does cost command points that could have opportunity cost elsewhere. If it's going to be the difference between using a ridiculously powerful stratagem that's going to get you a massive swing in another area, then it might just be worth holding off. I would say that it's a little bit less good if you wind up going first as opposed to going second, as if you go second, then you can drop down in the enemy turn 2 and then go on to charge in your turn 2. Whereas if you're going first, then the first time you'd be able to rapid ingress a unit is the enemy turn 2, so they'd only be able to act in your turn 3. A bit of a disadvantage there. Means that you might have to rethink things and perhaps just use things as standard reserves every so often if you need them in the game earlier. And you do have to commit things to reserve before you know who's going first or not, so it's not like you can preempt that. In general, I feel like Rapid Ingress maybe does up the value of reserves, though it's still probably not worth going overboard on them too much. I think you do get into diminishing returns, particularly if you're playing against an enemy army that can screen out a wide chunk of the board. If you've got absolutely loads of stuff in reserve, they're going to make absolute maximal effort to do that, and potentially punish a large chunk of your army, as opposed to just one unit. It perhaps makes Rapid Ingress a stratagem that's more useful in some matchups, maybe against more elite armies, as opposed to armies with just enormous board control. Let me know your thoughts though, and any triumphs or failures with Rapid Ingress so far in 10th edition 40k. Look forward to hearing any anecdotes down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help keep them coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.